what we do not want to do is to do an early deal with Putin when Putin clearly is under pressure in a number of different ways. And I think if we, as it were, sign a ceasefire too early, you give Putin that opportunity to regroup. Look, he's running out of money. Their cash supplies, which have been important in recruitment into the Russian military, are not more or less being drained. The price of energy, or Russian energy, is dropping because of the embargoes on its sale. And there's an opportunity here to increase Russia's difficulties. And Putin himself isn't in a great place. The war's a disaster.
Do we underestimate the level of threat posed by Iran here in the UK? There are more extraordinary details in the Times this morning about the suspected terror plots that appear to have been foiled when 7 Iranians were arrested at the weekend. Counter-terrorism police visited Iranian dissidents to warn of the threat posed by the regime in Tehran just days before those arrests. Of course, Iran is behind Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis. All of them are ranged against Israel at a time when the war in Gaza could escalate further. Plus, concerns are growing about the threat from Russia too, with reports the UK is re-examining the threat from Vladimir Putin. We can speak now to the former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove. Good morning.
Good morning, Kate.
Well, let's start with Iran, shall we? Where do you think this is going? There is a number of Iranian nationals are detained. What do you think the aim was here?
Probably it's aimed at the Iranian opposition, who are pretty numerous and active in the UK. So I would imagine, I mean, we haven't got the details, but perhaps it was a plot to assassinate, kidnap, attack, something to do with the either members of the opposition here or some of the media organizations that they run out of the UK. Alternatively, it could be an Israeli target or maybe a Jewish target. But Iran has been pretty aggressive, particularly towards its dissident community overseas. There's a long history of that.
And not yet potentially a step to a broader terror attack against the UK in terms of a sort of a mass attack. You think that that is something that Iran at the moment would not be looking to do?
Well, I'm not ruling that out, but it would be a massive escalation by Iran if they were using their intelligence organization, let's say, to attack a public event or a government building or something like that. I mean, that's really, it's not their modus operandi at the moment. So I think despite the seriousness of the threat and the extent of the reach of the IRGC, that's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that, as it were, commands and directs these arm's length activities, I wouldn't expect it to be a specifically British target, but it's still incredibly serious. And we've had the Director General of MI5 on several occasions, I think, warning about the threat. And it is also an escalation. I mean, maybe this is the basis for a ban. Prescribing IRGC as a terrorist organization, which it hasn't been hitherto, and I don't understand why it should have been a long time ago, in my view.
Yeah, the government has repeatedly said it doesn't talk about prescription, but there has been no move made that we understand to prescribe the IRGC at the moment. I mean, you mentioned Sir Ken McCallum, the head of MI5. He did warn in October last that Iran could focus on UK targets if Tehran felt that Britain had become a party to the conflict in the Middle East, basically in its support of Israel. Do you think that there is a risk that the UK's perceived support of Israel has made us more of a target?
Well, yes, in a sense it has, because we're an ally of Israel. We do supply them with some military equipment, actually not very much. They supply us with more. But any country, I think, that's actively backing and supporting Israel. But on the other hand, we've also been a critic of Israeli policy. So I'm not sure yet that it's escalated to that level. But you've always got to be aware of the risk and the possibility. And if the Director General of MI5 says something publicly, you take it very seriously. His public announcements are few and far between, and each one is carefully calibrated and certainly cleared governmentally before he makes them. So he's saying something serious that we should take note of.
And in your view, what difference would prescribing the IRGC make at this point?
Well, it categorizes very clearly what sort of organization it is, and it makes it easier in a number of ways to take specific measures against them, against their representative, against their activities. It's rather clear cut. I mean, it categorizes them as a terrorist organization. They therefore come under legislation which relates to the prevention of terrorism.
Elsewhere today, there are stories that the government is reportedly updating the Homeland Defence Plan. There is a suggestion it's 20 years out of date. Should we be concerned about that plan being so far out of date at this point?
Well, I think it's a reflection of the international situation. I mean, maybe it hasn't been updated because it didn't need to be. We're all aware now that we're in a state of, let's say, grey warfare with Russia. There's been lots of incidents in the European continent in particular, some in the UK, which can be traced back to Russian-supported activity, mainly by the GRU, Russian military intelligence. And it looks to me as though it's time that these documents were looked at again carefully and a clear, up-to-date statement made. I mean, it's important that the national security documentation, some of which is in the public domain issued by the Cabinet Office, should reflect exactly what the current threat level is.
Do you think the government takes seriously the threat of attack on things like undersea cables and, energy, potentially water infrastructure? Do you think enough is done at the moment to protect against attacks of that scale?
Well, we haven't done a lot in the past. I think recently, yes, we've been taken very seriously. And I think the government has a good track record, both Conservative and Labour governments, of looking now very seriously at these issues. I mean, communication cables are the sort of lifeblood of the international communication system. And being an island, we're particularly vulnerable if they're cut. And, we're all aware already that there have been incidents where there is suspicion that ships under Russian control or with Russian crews have attacked cables with their anchors and cut them, but more sophisticated capability they have as well undersea to cut them. Yeah, it's something we really have to take very seriously indeed.
We were speaking earlier to Vladimir Milov. He was a former Russian energy minister, and he was suggesting to us that President Putin is under a significant amount of economic pressure currently. But there is a risk that he will agree a ceasefire deal in order to regroup, and that basically he will use that time only to pause the conflict and not to end it. Milov was suggesting to us that America has been naive in its approach to Putin so far. What is your take on that?
I'm in a certain amount of agreement, because what we do not want to do is to do an early deal with Putin when Putin clearly is under pressure in a number of different ways. And I think if we, as it were, sign a ceasefire too early, you give Putin that opportunity to regroup. Look, he's running out of money. Their cash supplies, which have been important in recruitment into the Russian military, are not more or less being drained. The price of energy, or Russian energy, is dropping because of the embargoes on its sale. And there's an opportunity here to increase Russia's difficulties. And Putin himself isn't in a great place. The war's a disaster. There must be a lot of people in his immediate circle who are beginning to wonder about him and his leadership. And in terms of their military performance, the general analytical view of the Russian military is it's going downhill rather than increasing. So there is a point where if we do an early deal, we're giving him a gift to have a rest and recuperate. And the pressure needs to be maintained. And the likelihood is, if that's the case, then perhaps Ukraine gets a better prospect than it has at the moment.
It's an interesting prospect for those talks. Just finally, we've been talking about VE Day and the celebrations for VE Day, the 80th anniversary, of course, this week. Over the course of the programme, some people have suggested it looked like there were not vast numbers of people on the Mall, that maybe the celebrations were a bit muted, that maybe there wasn't as much in terms of, air power, in terms of the fly past as people had expected. What do you make of those suggestions?
Well, 80 years ago is a long time. I was a few months old on VE Day, and I think it's quite difficult to generate in a new generation the understanding and the realization of the importance of the anniversary. Actually, I would have taken the view that I was quite surprised so many people did turn up, and that so many people were in central London celebrating what for many of us is a crucially important anniversary. So, it cuts both ways. How long does the historical memory last? How long do these anniversaries remain relevant? Do we stop after 100 years? There are other anniversaries which maybe are 200 years old. How do you generate interest in those? So I think this is a question of how you look at history and how you interpret it and what impact it has on the. But I think what's interesting is, certainly from my own experience when I was behind the Iron Curtain and witnessed the 9th of May anniversaries, they were massive. They were absolutely huge. And we've never in the West celebrated them to the extent that the Soviet Union and its allies celebrated them in the aftermath of World War II. There's some complicated issues here.
Do you think we should celebrate them in a bigger way?
No, I think that it's about right. And I don't think we should sort of glorify too much, what was a catastrophic war and the relief at the end of it. And, I can remember the aftermath of World War II as a child, and it really did overshadow one's life and one's perceptions. And that lasted for a long time, but these things fade and become more historical than personal issues. And we're on the cusp of that change from being a personal experience to being historical experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Sir Richard, many thanks for your time.